thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. It's really a great pleasure for me. And I want to, as many of you know, the idea of neurophilosophy is really to explore the impact of developments in neuroscience, but in science generally, really, but to explore the impact on long-standing issues in philosophy. And one of those very long-standing issues has to do with where moral values come from. And we can see in, for example, the Platonic dialogues, the Socratic discussions of value and how you know what's right and how you know what's wrong. And these are issues that have preoccupied us for a long time. And so I want to tell you today a little bit about my thinking on this in the light of new developments in neuroscience. So I think it's not controversial that there is a very, very deep level of value, inasmuch as all organisms have to be wired to see to their own survival. That's the way biological evolution works. And so we are wired to seek warmth, shelter, food, and so forth. And as Paul MacLean used to say, we're wired to succeed at the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproduction. And it's very easy to understand in an evolutionary context how there can be very deep values that are related to oneself. And the question, though, has been, how is it possible, then, that there should be other regarding values? How is it possible that there should be moral values in the sense, and this will be a limited sense, but it's going to be good enough for my purpose, in the sense that individuals, not just humans, but others, individuals will incur a cost in order to obtain a benefit for someone else. How could that possibly work? Now, evolutionary biologists have been inclined, especially if they knew nothing about the brain, have been inclined to think that those sorts of values have to be kind of hammered into you. And that only if we do that can we expect appropriate behavior. And so Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene says, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. Now, I think actually Richard has modified his view somewhat, but that is a view that was very common amongst evolutionary biologists. But it's very interesting that Darwin himself did not hold that view. So in The Descent of Man, published 1871, Darwin asked the question, where does our moral sense or our conscience come from? And Darwin thought there were essentially 3 components to the story. There are social instincts. We like to be social. We don't like isolation. Habits and skills that we acquire, and reason. And interestingly enough, these are really comparable or reflect the very same structure and conceptual organization that we find in Aristotle, but also in those wonderful 18th century Scots, David Hume and Adam Smith. Now, what's changed, I think, is that as a result of developments in neuroscience, but also anthropology, psychology, genetics, and so forth, we're able to say many things about the nature of these social instincts, about habits and skills, and about reasoning, things that were not available to Darwin or Hume, Smith, and Aristotle. In this slide, I really just want to remind us of data from anthropology. On the vertical axis, we have years in millions, and we have spatial extent horizontally. And what this reminds us is that there are many species of humans. And that some, like Homo erectus, for example, who had a brain of about 800 cc's, lasted for about 1.5 million years. He did very well. They lived, of course, in small groups. They were hunters and scavengers and gatherers. Homo erectus, interestingly enough, managed to use fire. They also got themselves to Indonesia using rafts where they were logs bound together with twine vines. There we are, Homo sapiens up here, and it's important to realize that we've been on the planet, we Homo sapiens, for about 250,000 years, and that only in the last 10,000 years do we see agriculture and the accumulation of larger groups. Hitherto, it is believed, mainly on the basis of anthropological data on existing hunter-gatherer groups, that people in those small groups did not have anything like an organized religion. That organized religion came much later, well after the beginning of agriculture. And yet, those small groups appear to have, as we know very well, for example, from understanding the Inuit culture, they had norms for settling disputes, for dealing with problems when there are scarce resources, what to do with orphans, how to reconcile after disputes, and so forth. And this is common in general. Now, this is probably not a point that needs to be made in this context, but because it's very common to think that religion is somehow the font of moral knowledge and right and wrong, it's important to realize that that can't possibly be right. Because understanding right and wrong, reconciling, consoling, settling disputes, that all happened long before there was organized religion. And we think that part of the reason that religion came to be prominent after the advent of agriculture and the accumulation of large groups is that now not everybody knows everybody else. And sometimes people are off by themselves and you want to be able to have some control over them. And so religions, especially those that came about in the Middle East, appeared to have ideas about how to control the behavior when your mom and dad and your aunt and uncle and so forth aren't around. And I think that's really rather well captured in this slide, is that even if authority figures are not around, nevertheless, someone is watching you. It's also important in this context to realize that the model of religion that grew out of the Middle East, where there is a lawgiver and a stern father figure and so forth, is not the model for all religions, even in very large groups. It is not the model for religions in many Eastern territories. And so we see, for example, the great thinker Confucius and Mencius, who did not think of themselves as divine in any sense, but as simply talking about reasonable ways of getting on in life. And it's very Aristotelian. So that brings me kind of to where we are in moral philosophy, 20th century, 21st century. And here I think this kind of oversimplifies, but it captures the basic point, is that there are sort of two centers of gravity in the literature, in the philosophical literature on the nature of morality. One takes the legal model as the prototype, that we must have rules, they must apply absolutely to everybody, they must apply unconditionally, and if we get the rules right, they apply to all people at all times under all circumstances. And in that model, then, the task for many philosophers, the task they set themselves, is to articulate those rules. The other model has its roots in Aristotle, in Confucius, in Hume, and in Darwin. And it's that we are motivated to be social, we like to be social, finding ourselves isolated is painful, and that constitutes a kind of basic platform on which norms can arise and norms can be learned. And so I'll say a lot more about that as we go through. So the legal model has really prevailed in moral philosophy, and I want to say a little bit about two of the kind of main streams of this. One, of course, derives from Kant, but I mean, he was really rooted in the tradition of Moses. And what he wanted to do was to find a rule, which was really kind of a test of other rules, which would apply universally and always. And so his idea was that you have to get emotion completely out of the story. You have to be perfectly rational. And that if you do that, if all of us are doing that, we will come to the same idea, the same principles of what's morally right and wrong. And that's because we will be consistent. And as long as you are completely consistent, was his idea. As long as you follow that principle of logic, you will get there. Now, people quickly realize that, total nutters can be completely consistent. You can have very extreme fanatics who are completely consistent. I mean, just as you and I might think that, yes, if we cheat on our taxes, we should be punished, they might say, yes, if you're a woman who is raped, you should be killed. And that would apply to me, too. So it's not that difficult, if you like, to be consistent, especially if the emotions are not part of the story. So there are many problems with Kant's story, and so a very different way of thinking about things came about with Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham really, I think, was responding to laws that came directly out of religion, such as laws about blasphemy. And so the principle that he and Henry Sidgwick, and much later in a modified form, John Stuart Mill espoused, was that we must look only at the consequences, and the consequences must be such as to maximize aggregate utility. Now, as I'm sure you know, and those of you who've taken a first-year philosophy course, even if you didn't take any more, know that there are many, many problems with the idea of maximizing aggregate utility, not least of which is this, recently articulated by the utilitarian Tom Scanlon at Harvard, that your own children and your own family must not count for more in your moral decisions than a completely unknown person on the other side of the planet. It's biologically very implausible. That doesn't work. And there are many, many other problems which I don't really want to go into here, but we can talk about further in the discussion. But maximizing aggregate utility, it's very hard to quantify. We're not always sure what utility is. Different people find different things make them happy. It can also become very meddlesome in the sense that you might be absolutely convinced that what I need to do to be truly happy is to become a Scientologist. And so you might do whatever you can, right, under your conception of maximizing utility to make me a happy Scientologist. Not really my preference. So let's go back then. If the legal model of morality is perhaps correct in some ways, but fundamentally flawed, let's go back to the idea of social instincts, habits, skills, and reason. Now, there are a number of elements that I think are really important to the changing landscape of how we think about the nature of morality. And I'm just quickly going to go through those. One concerns the tremendous developments in really, really good research on non-human social behavior. There's also, of course, the developments regarding sociality and its neuroendocrinological underpinnings. And I want to say a little bit about the extraordinary developments in neuroscience regarding the basal ganglia and the role of the basal ganglia as they connect to cortical structures in the acquisition of habits and skills. It turns out that the basal ganglia are important not just for what we think of as kind of highly routinized habits, but for all kinds of skills, including social skills. and that it isn't just a cortical story when we make a decision about what to do in a morally troubling context. Also in the mix are really, really important developments, I think, both, of course, in genetics, but also in the understanding of brain evolution. Harvey Carton, I think, who is still probably a member of the psychiatry department, has for many years tried to show us how ancient many of the structures in modern human brains are, how ancient are their roots. And now the data from genetics and from anatomy are coming in such a way that we're beginning to see that evolution is much more conservative. It makes a tweak, an expansion, a cutback. The regulatory genes make a bit more of this and a bit less of that. But the structures themselves are highly conserved. The neurochemicals are highly conserved. Finally, I think the tremendous advancements made in understanding the hippocampus, and for our purposes in particular, understanding how it is that you can do offline imagining and predicting and evaluating. And we've learned at least enough about the hippocampus to get ideas about how that can operate on issues other than just spatial location, and how it might be done in other structures. So let me say a little bit about the developments in ethology, because I think they have been hugely important in loosening this very firm assumption that humans alone are moral, that humans alone can reason, we alone are cooperative, and so forth. Franz de Waal, who's the director at Yerkes, of course, has been way out front on this for a long time. But it's important that in chimpanzees, for example, both in the wild and in these large field stations, such as at Yerkes and in Marseille, that we see reconciliation behavior. In this slide, we also see consolation behavior. One of the one who is being consoled was beaten up in a fight. The other one has no real percentage in consoling, but they do that, and they do that regularly. They document in very careful studies pro-social choice, so that a chimpanzee has an option of getting a goodie just for him or getting a goodie for him and his pal. They almost always go for this. Occasionally they'll go there, but they go for what provides for both. Chris Besh in the Gombe Reserve, in the Ngogo Reserve, has seen 5 distinct instances of male chimpanzees, unrelated to orphans, adopting those orphans. They ride around on the back, they teach them how to crack nuts, and so forth. And at first, people just didn't believe it. They did, of course, the DNA studies to determine whether there was any relationship, and there wasn't. They weren't the dads. So it is a very interesting result. But we also see alloparenting in TT monkeys in South America and also in marmosets. Guys, the dads, of course, do the bulk of the parenting if they're marmosets, and they often alloparent and take care of others if the other guy happens to be out doing something else. Now, in what I want to do next is just to show you, because I think amongst philosophers at any rate, and it's probably very different here, there's great reserve about whether any of these experiments can ever really show what we're supposed to show, because the thought is it's really all anecdata, or it's really all anthropomorphism. So I'm going to show you an experiment that was done at Yerkes. It was a Sarah Brosnahan, Franz de Waal experiment. And this is to demonstrate that the capuchin monkeys have a sense of fairness. Now, the background data I want to give you is that the capuchins are very fond of slices of cucumber. They're very happy to eat them, and they also like grapes, but they really prefer grapes. And so what you're going to see here, and you'll hear Franz de Waal's voice. I hope this works. We'll hear Franz's voice describing what happens. And you're going to see that one monkey gets a cucumber. The way it works, by the way, is they have a little bucket of stones in the cage, and the monkey has to give the experimenter a stone, and then she will give him a cucumber. And then he sees the cage mate next door get a grape. Okay, so let us try this. And
getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does.
And he's upset, you can see. He sees the other one get
she gets a grape.
All right, so.
And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again
now,
cucumber.
She's going to give him a cucumber.
She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us.
He gives her the rock.
And she gets cucumber again.
Now it's important in this to notice that it's not that that they don't like
getting grape, and
they
you
like
will see what happens.
Just fine. What they see
so she gives
is
a rock
that
to us. That's the
unfairness. Now in the next couple of slides, I just want to tell you a little bit about. I mean, that was just such a tiny little bit, but go on to YouTube if you want to see the whole thing. So in the next slide, I want to show you something. This was a very recently published paper by a group in Moscow in Wasserman's lab, and they were interested in Crow's reasoning. And as I'm sure you know, there's been a tremendous amount of work done with crows and other corvids because they seem to be able to know what things look like to another's point of view, so they have at least a rudimentary theory of mind. In this case, the question was, can they do a match to sample, not just when it's identity, but when it's relational? So in this first test, for example, he will see this, and he has to get that. And he'll see this, and he has to get that. But here, notice that it isn't an identity. To get the goodie sorry, I guess I should do it this way. Oh, bloody hell. To get the goodie, he has to make the connection same shape or same matching. He has to see that it's relational, not that it's identical. And that's also the case, as you can see, in 8. So they did it for shape, and then they also did it for color. And you can see that doing the identity match is fairly simple. But then doing the relational match, the two gray strips, 4 and 8, is rather more complicated. The crows can do this, and I'll show you in a minute. But the amazing thing is, all they had to teach them was the identity match. They didn't have to teach them the relational match. They figured it out. Now, why do I care? I mean, I care because analogical reasoning, that is, doing a pattern recognition problem, is almost certainly really crucial in moral behavior. Because very often, the situation you're encountering is somewhat novel. And you have to be able to take your understanding and applying it to a new case. You have to be able to reason analogically. And I think it's very important that these guys can reason analogically, and they can do it without language. Okay, so now what you're going to see is the crow, and you will see the plate come to the front and then be pushed in. And I'll just go, the video itself is really quite long, but I just want to give you a feel for how this works, because they're very quick. So it comes in, and now he pushes it forward and gets it right away, all right? So that's the relational case. That one was easy. But still, it's the relational one. So they're doing a somewhat abstract analogy. And here we go again. So he has to know that the stimuli on the card are not supposed to be identical. They have to be different. All right. So I think that is important, and it's important for another reason, and that is probably some of this kind of learning, that is learning to reason analogically, is also a skill. And it's a skill that almost certainly involves subcortical structures. So I'll put put aside now the comments from ethology, except to say that some other things that I think are really interesting have been learned, and they suggest kinds of experiments. So many of you will know about the Peggy Mason experiment, where she had a rat in a plexiglass trap, and another rat comes in and eventually learns how to open the trap, and the rat comes out. He doesn't need to do that. He has to overcome the emotional contagion of fear. He has to overcome being in a wide open space in order to do this. Moreover, after he's done this a number of times, and you can see this on YouTube too, after he's done this a number of times, they put in another plexiglass tube containing chocolate chips. Now, what you might think, if you had a very dim view of the morality or the sociability of rats, is he'd just go and eat up the chocolate chips and then let the friend out. He doesn't. He lets out the friend. They both go to the other one. He opens it. They both share the chips. So animal behavior is turning out, when you look at it closely and you control for all kinds of variables, to be a lot more interesting than we might have thought. So I'm going through these different areas very, very quickly, and each one of them deserves much more time. But I want to touch on all of them. So neuroendocrinology, of course, is extremely important. How did it come to be, one might well ask, that in mammals and birds we see this very powerful behavior of parents caring for offspring? How did that come to be? How is it that in a certain sense there are changes in the circuitry such that just as the mother rat cares for her own warmth and safety and food, it's as though the offspring are part of her because the way she cares for their warmth and safety and food. And part of the answer is thought to be owed to the evolution of homeotherms. So warm-blooded animals would have a great advantage 250 million years ago because they could forage at night, and they could also forage in cold places. The downside of being a homeotherm is that you have to eat 10 times as much, gram for gram of weight. If you have to eat a lot, it also probably helps to be somewhat clever. And Mother Nature realized that rather than trying to touch up the genes to prepare for all kinds of different environments and contingencies, it was much better to just let the animal learn. And a really smart way of doing that is to have the animals born dependent. But if the animal is born dependent, there better be somebody to take care of its food and warmth and safety. And at least in the beginning, that is probably the mom. Although we know now in the case of mice that even mice, the males will also share in the care. So the hypothesis is that sociability, as we see it in birds and mammals, is, as Darwin rightly suspected, a basic value, and that it's something that is selected for biologically. Probably the hub of the story is oxytocin and the opioids, and probably serotonin plays an important role in this as well. And that the norms that have, at least in the legal model, so dominated the conversation, probably emerge from the reward system. So let me say a little bit about neuroendocrinology. Of course, everybody now knows the story of the prairie voles and the difference between prairie voles and the montane voles. And it is really, really a striking difference. And what has happened, I guess, in the 20 years since the first discovery of the importance of oxytocin in the nucleus accumbens of the prairie voles, I seem to be losing my clothes, is there has been an attempt to understand in much finer grained detail precisely what it is that oxytocin does and where receptors contribute to sociality and where oxytocin receptors actually don't. And one of the early findings that was really kind of striking, but I certainly didn't pick up on it, but a couple of other people did, was this, that it's not just that the prairie voles mate and bond for life, it's that the whole family is somewhat social. And the siblings from the first litter will help raise the siblings of the second litter and so forth. So there's quite a lot of alloparenting on the part of the siblings. So then the careful measurements were made about, this was done in Larry Young's lab, those siblings, not yet with their own children, those who alloparent well and those who don't. And the interesting finding was all about oxytocin receptors. The poor alloparenters had more oxytocin receptors in the lateral septum. And so he thought at the time that this was very curious. And of course, it suggests something which would not be news to this audience, but is certainly news to Paul Zak. And that is that oxytocin isn't a love molecule, that its actions are highly dependent on the particular circuitry. So another thing that, another whole dimension of research that these findings spawned and has helped us understand the nature of attachment and bonding had to do with comparisons with other animals. But in the course of this, I put in this slide because I wanted to kind of recognize the progression from a me-centered organism, maybe a frog, to an animal that takes its offspring as part of itself, and then to an animal, a highly social animal, maybe minor tweaks in the receptor density for oxytocin, for mu opioids or for kappa opioids somewhere, that extends friendliness and caring to kith. And this seems to me to be the platform for morality in general, that caring constitutes the sort of baseline platform on which you can do other things, build cooperation, for example, because you trust each other. Now, one of the other findings more recently has been to look very closely at the brains of meadow voles. Now, meadow voles turn out to be interesting because they were thought to be solitary animals, but it turns out it's not quite right. They're solitary in the summer, but in the winter when it's cold, they congregate in groups of 10 or 20, and they huddle together, and they have a sort of best friend in this huddling condition. And the question was, well, why are they loners in the summer and social in the winter? What changes in the brain? And it turns out there are a number of changes, but the one that I'm going to mention here has to do with oxytocin receptor density in the lateral septum. And in the summer, the density goes up, and in the winter, the density goes down. And those who are the biggest huddlers in the winter, who really like to hang out with their pals, have a bigger decline in oxytocin receptor density in the lateral septum than those who don't. Now, one of the questions I will have for you as psychiatrists is something like this, that when we do experiments that involve, when we do experiments that involve spraying oxytocin up the nose, first of all, of course, we don't really know where it goes and it has to cross the blood-brain barrier and blah, blah, blah. What if some of it goes to receptors in the lateral septum? I mean, we're making an assumption that it's going to all be good, but it might not be. It might not be entirely pro-social. And it's worth noting that there have been, despite very careful and very controlled experiments, failures to replicate those early data that came out of Ernst Fehr's lab in Zurich, the Kostfeld data. And so I think things are a little bit more up in the air with regard to testing what oxytocin does by using intranasal administration. Now, I'm going fast over a lot of this because I really want to sort of sketch out the big picture. All right. So I'm going to move away from the neuroendocrinology in part. I mean, I think the endocrinological story and the importance of affect in sociality is the kind of platform and basic foundation for everything else. But of course, the basal ganglia in its connections to thalamus, cortex, and hippocampus have turned out, as we now know from a range of techniques used to explore these structures, to be very important. Probably the most salient paper on the basal ganglia that really set off a lot of researchers in the basal ganglia direction was the paper by Wolfram Schultz in 1997. And as most of you will know, the finding was this. So what you're looking at are histogram, of course, on the top and individual neuron spikes on the bottom. You'll see the recordings are in monkey in the VTA. And what you will see is that the monkey's just kind of sitting there in his chair hanging out. And right here, he gets a squirt of orange juice. And right here, of course, you see a phasic activation of the neurons. Now, when the reward is paired with, let's say, a light flashes on or a bell or what have you with a conditional stimulus, and once the animal has learned the task, what you notice is that nothing much happens at the reward, but it all happens at the stimulus. And so finally, of course, if the light comes on, but there is no reward, then there is a damping down of the activity, the phasic activity of those neurons, dopaminergic neurons in the VTA. And this got everybody very excited because, for one thing, they could see how that might interface with known ideas at the behavioral sciences about the nature of reward learning and how we could actually use an algorithm to understand what was going on there. Nevertheless, many, many outstanding questions remained, like what causes this to flatten out? What causes that? What is it? If this is a prediction of error that is different from what was expected, where does the information about the nature of that expectation come from? Because those neurons in the VTA themselves are not little smart homunculi doing calculations. So there have been many, many approaches to trying to understand this, some at the single cell level, some with humans using lesions, some involving track tracing of one kind or another. In humans, of course, we know that there are, and monkeys also, that other structures in cortex are important, the ventromedial, prefrontal, the anterior cingulate, and certainly also the insula. And Montague Lab, for example, at Virginia Tech, has been trying to sort out, using functional MR on patients who have selective lesions, either in the insula or the ACC or the medial prefrontal medial PFC, to see what the differences are in recognition of a norm violation, in adapting to a norm change, in making a decision about what to do about a norm violation. And as I'm sure you know, there are now very efficient ways of using games, neuroeconomic games like the ultimatum game, across many, many kinds of situations where you can then get highly controlled, highly quantifiable information about what's going on. Suffice it to say that I think many of the questions remain outstanding. There's just still an awful lot that we don't understand about the basal ganglia. One thing, of course, we would very much like to know is what are the monosynaptic inputs to the VTA and also the substantia nigra, pars compacta. And that work is ongoing. Uchida, who was here, I guess, last week, and has used a range of techniques, including using the rabies virus in order to figure out what's projecting to the VTA, has also found that the lateral hypothalamus projects monosynaptically to the VTA. And that's very interesting because it helps us understand, I think, at least in a vague and unquantifiable sort of way, why it is that affect is so strongly involved in skills and habits and so forth, and why it is that we feel a certain kind of disquiet when we're changing a tire but we're not doing it in the right way, or when we're cleaning a chicken and we're not doing it in the usual way. We feel, I shouldn't be doing it that way. And I think the same sort of movement of affect is probably also involved when we contemplate doing an action that we're worried about. That we have that anxiety flicker. We have that sort of feeling which people call gut feelings, but it's really the basal ganglia talking to you. We have those feelings of, yeah, this is going to be okay, or this is really not good. And it's, I think, what Darwin was on about when he talked about conscience, or when Socrates talks about that little voice that says, don't do it that way, don't do that. It's really that discomfort, that disapproval that's been internalized by the basal ganglia. All right. I'm going to say one very fast thing about social problem solving, and I think much of what we see that constitutes norms are conventions, rituals, and sometimes norms that are very serious that have to do with deception or cheating or truth-telling and so forth. It seems most likely that these arise in a very natural way, and did in hunter-gatherer groups, that they arise in a natural way as a result of confronting certain kinds of very practical problems. And we see a very similar kind of thing, actually. I was recently at this wonderful meeting on sign language and the evolution of sign language. So there are many, many different sign languages. They just sort of spring up using gestures in the first generation. But in the second generation, we see a pattern that emerges again and again across all different kinds of sign languages. And the pattern is that instead of referring to Bill by spelling it out, you use a plane, a spatial plane in front of you. Basically, you're inventing pronominal reference. And you put Bill here, and you put Sally there, and then you can talk about Bill, and you can talk about Sally without having to spell it all out. It's very efficient, in other words. And so we see lots and lots of times that different cultures come up with very similar ways of handling internal conflict, scarcity of resources, defense, and so forth. Now, there are some variations, but many of the variations are really at a fairly superficial level. I mean, they have to do with dress, for example. I mean, can you just cover yourself from the waist down, or do you have to cover the whole of yourself? And I mean, this is just anecdata, but I remember as a child, one of the few things that we had out there in the bush was the National Geographic. And it was very shocking to me to see that there were ladies in Africa who didn't wear anything on top. And I thought, I'd like to try and see what that would feel like. And of course, it was just just not possible. I mean, all your feelings are against it. And that's because of the way the basal ganglia work, the way skill learning works, the way disapproval and approval work as you're acquiring norms of behavior. And of course, it's also true that norms vary from within a culture from group to group. So we used to, of course, have very specific ways of talking to our friends, and we would curse like crazy. But then you go home, and you don't do that at all. And so you know what the norms are, and you adjust your behavior accordingly. And what we'd like to know, of course, is why in the human case there is so much rewarding, endogenously probably attached to imitation. Why is it that we so like especially as children, but not only as children, to imitate, even if we're not necessarily getting approval for imitating? And I think that remains very much an open question. We do see, of course, imitation in other animals, but in humans, it's really prodigious. So to conclude, then, we do have these two traditions. I think the skill model explains much more of the way real morality works. This isn't going to provide us with any rules about whether a flat tax is fair or whether doctor-assisted suicide is the right thing. It's not going to give us those kinds of answers. But people with appropriate social skills can talk to other such people and maybe come up with some good ideas. So moral norms and values seem not to be supernatural. They don't seem to be esoteric or Platonic, as Plato himself thought, that they were very abstract and only with this enormously important intellectual capacity that just a few philosophers have, could you really appreciate what was in there? They're not unconditional, and they have ancient evolutionary roots. And with that, I should maybe explain this slide. So most of us who learned anything about orangs were told that orangs are solitary. And indeed, in their natural habitat, they are. They are vegetarians. They need very large territory in order to feed themselves. So apart from mother-infant relationships, they tend, on the whole, to be loners. But as with many, many things, we find that when the resources are plentiful and when there's no real downside, they make friends. And in this particular instance, this was at a rescue center in Iowa where this orang was, and the dog came in one day. And the orang had been pretty much on his own until the dog came in. And once the dog came in, they were inseparable. They go everywhere together, and you can see, I mean, the gestures are really quite wonderful. And so I think part of what we're also learning is that a very narrow evolutionary biological idea that everything you do has to be somehow conducive to your reproductive fitness, at least in big-brained animals, is probably not the case. There's probably lots of flexibility. There's lots of room for slop, for doing funny stuff, like becoming attached to a dog. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Churchland, for your wonderful presentation. I remind the audience that unfortunately we are acoustically challenged today, which means we don't have a microphone to go around.
Should I repeat the question?
You might repeat the question. So keep your questions pithy, not a paragraph with punctuation and that, just a brief question. Okay, that would be great if you could repeat it. Okay, so Dr. Perry, you were the first. Speak up.
She said.
She doesn't have to repeat that.
Oh.
But it's true.
Thank you.
think we probably heard the questions.
Okay, so, yeah. Good. All right. So I think that the question of the role of religion really needs to be put in its proper anthropological context. And we can see, for example, that many, many Asian religions that don't have anything like the Ten Commandments, people are every bit as good. It's not like, there is a sort of moral breakdown. So we've somehow convinced ourselves, on the basis of really no evidence, that if you don't have a religion that includes the mighty lawgiver, that all hell breaks loose. This is wrong. And the Asian religions that are very Confucian, for example, have great respect for elders, great respect for ancestors, for traditions, although they also agree that it's possible to modify traditions. They recognize the wisdom and things that Confucius said, but they don't think of these things as rules. And so I think Collins is just wrong about that. And we know this also from, for example, the Inuit culture. These people have very good ways of settling disputes. They have ways of controlling within group competition and not tolerating assault. And they don't have any, they talk about the spirit of the whale and the spirit of winter, but this is not like the whale was a lawgiver or anything like that. So it's clearly, it's clearly not necessary. And so that I think would be the important thing there. Now, the other thing is on the Carol Gilligan thing, I don't know that it divides so neatly into males and females. There's been some really beautiful studies on how kids respond to exactly those kinds of questions in different cultures. So in a very rule-based culture, like an American culture, you get answers like, would it be okay to lie if blah, blah? No, that would be wrong. Now, but in Asian cultures, the kids, here's what they typically say is, well, it depends. If this, then that would be wrong. But if that, then it might be okay. So in other words, the culture is really informing how you go about making your moral decisions. And the people who did this work also ran these tests in Vancouver. Igor will like this. In the Chinese communities in Richmond versus those in the Caucasian communities in West Point Grey. See the same differences. You think, no, it'd be wrong to lie. This kid says, well, I could see that would be all right if. And so it's not that you see any difference in the actual on-the-hoof moral behavior of these children. They're all pretty good kids, but they think about it differently. And it might actually be better if we think about it, if we're more accurate. We don't sort of make up the idea that if we don't have rules, we'll fall apart. There was this wonderful Colbert report where he interviewed this guy who was a state senator from Louisiana. And the senator from Louisiana had really made his name by insisting that the Ten Commandments be in the House legislature, right there so everybody could see. And his argument was, if you don't know the Ten Commandments, you can't have a moral life. You don't know what to do. So he comes and Colbert says, okay, this is very interesting. You've done all this. And he said, what are the Ten Commandments? So he says, don't kill. You all know that's not how they start. And then he says, don't lie. And Colbert says, yeah, and then what? And he couldn't go on. Now, that's not a surprise. We all kind of know what the appropriate things are, but it's not because we are slavishly adhering to the Ten Commandments. And that's because, as kids, we all learned that there is a right time to lie. When Grandma says, do I look fat in these jeans? You say, you look great. Okay? I mean, we all know that. And we all know that even in a very serious situation, you may have to lie. Even though Kant, for example, said, better that the whole world go to ruin than that you tell a lie. Well, I mean, that just seems to be dopey. So we all learn the norms, but we all learn that there's shades, and that slavishly following a rule like don't lie is sort of the mark of someone who doesn't have appropriate social skills. And so this is, I think, kind of deep unspoken knowledge that we all have. And then we're fed, it's some story about how you have to go to church and learn the Ten Commandments, otherwise you won't know what's right and wrong. By the time you're 2, you know what's right and wrong.
So it sounds like the story about the presidential candidate who couldn't name the agencies that he wanted to
That's right.
down.
That's
so
right.
Yes. Yes, so David Welsh.
So I'm intrigued by your idea that the moral compass arises really from the basal ganglia in generating the sense of discomfort.
Yeah. I think it is related. I mean, I absolutely do. And Anne Graybiel, who is a basal ganglia anatomist and physiologist at MIT, sees that connection also. I mean, we don't know what the differences are, such that you have normal anxiety to taking a different route home, to having to take your usual route home. We don't really know in detail what those are, but she certainly thinks they're related, and I think that they almost certainly are. I mean, the nucleus accumbens, ventral striatum, have the capacity to do value coding, and they are connected to the hypothalamus. And so it seems likely at this stage. I mean, granted, we could have our socks surprised off us, but at the moment, it just seems very likely that something like that is the case. And even in speech, again, we were talking about this at the language evolution meeting, is that people have very particular ways of speaking and moving, and those are all almost certainly also rooted in this chunking apparatus that the basal ganglia produces, so that you have these big chunks of stuff that you do, and the basal ganglia seems to really like to have chunks. It's more efficient than, and it goes into chunking mode as soon as something is well learned. So I'm guessing that, but I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I get to sort of speculate aimlessly. But that seems to me where the gold is, yeah. Yeah. Very recent.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on the clinical situation that sometimes arises, actually when an individual has either poorly controlled temporal lobe epilepsy,
right,
or when they have an ablation to decrease the frequency of their seizures, and how that can result in a hyperbiliopathy.
Oh, yeah. That's really kind of beyond my purview. I mean, I know that there is that connection, and that people can sometimes have these really rather remarkable experiences, either post or before the seizure itself. And it certainly is cause for real interest. But But I think those kind of amazing experiences can be produced in other ways, as we know. I mean, they can be produced by drugs. And I'm a big yoga person, and at first I thought the meditating part of it at the end was, I didn't take it too seriously, especially because sometimes the practitioners give you all this metaphysical, stuff. And, but then, I really I thought, well, I'll go along with the gag. And then I started to, really have these wonderful feelings. I'm lying there, I'm floating. I can see why people think they're literally floating. I never did, but at least to the best of my knowledge. But you can get extraordinary experiences in lots of ways. You can, the nuns in the Middle Ages used to do it by starving themselves, right? And then when they were really, really, really hungry, they would have visions. And then they'd eat some turkey and get their serotonin, and they felt better again.
Good. John, I think you were next.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I want to ask you a question from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah.
Many evolutionary biologists or theorists would argue that altruism cannot evolve.
Yeah.
Evolve
Yeah.
And has not evolved, despite those pictures right in front of us.
Yeah.
Because there's always the advantage for one individual to simply not give it, keep it to himself, or take it from the other one. It increases that individual's fitness. So I just wonder about your thoughts about that, and because you're clearly illustrating and arguing evolution of
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
altruism. How do you answer these theories?
Well, I think the data go against it. I don't think that there's anything like an altruism gene. So if they thought that to suppose there could be altruistic behavior, there has to be an altruism gene, then of course we're not on board with that. What there does seem to be is in the rewiring of the brain of mammals and birds, there does seem to be this organization that involves caring for others. And in the first instance, the others are the offspring. But small changes in that can produce caring for others, kin, for example, and mates. And especially if those small changes are such that you end up thriving because you're living in a group, not because of group selection, right? But individually, you all have this. And you live in a group and you engage in cooperation and defense, then you'll do better and you'll pass on more genes. So I think when we look at something like marmoset monkeys, they live in groups, they're intensely social, they do very well because of their sociality, and probably you would say the same is true of chimpanzees and baboons and so forth. So the free rider problem, I think, is more complicated than people have thought. And one of the things that happens in group animals is that they have systems of punishment for really badly behaved individuals. This is true of chimpanzees, it's true of wolves, of monkeys, and third-party individuals are willing to incur a cost to punish the miscreant. And the other thing is, of course, if you are wired for sociality, so you really like to be together, and you feel pain at separation, then it's no surprise that one of the standard things you see in social animals by way of punishment is you kick the guy out. And they don't like it. And we also know, and here again, there's really careful data, that the animal that's kicked out, the lone wolf, the lone baboon, they don't last very long. The lone wolf can't last very long because he's reduced to scrounging for mice. He's not involved in bringing down the caribou. And so by and large, the wiring ensures that you like to be together and you feel pain at separation, so you're going to incur a cost. But there's given variability that we all know is the driver of evolution, there's always going to be variability in how social an individual is within the group. But it does seem that social mammals and also social birds will punish those who are not appropriately social. And the field studies on this is interesting, but so are the studies right within in these big field stations like Voles. Yeah. I don't think that fully answers the question.
Sounds like group selection.
Oh, no. It can't be group. I mean, not group selection. It's just that if everyone in the group has lots of oxytocin receptors in the nucleus accumbens, and they like each other a lot, and they like to be together, they tend to trust each other, they tend to cooperate with each other, they take care of each other's babies, and lo and behold, they have more babies. So it's not group selection. Yeah.
Take a couple more questions and we'll come around. Yes, go ahead. Please speak up.
Yes, I'm experimenting with the groups. I have a question about Frederick Nietzsche. I was wondering if you could comment on his idea that God is dead, and that we know the difference between good and evil, independent of church and state and social constructs and
Yeah.
higher power or our social environment.
No, I mean, I think this picks up on Barbara's question. The thing is that it does appear that hunter-gatherer societies who do not have any conception of the great creator, the great lawgiver, the big guy in the sky, they don't have anything like that, nevertheless have appropriate social norms. They care about each other, they're kind to each other, they're generous, they punish the miscreants, they take care of orphans. They have everything that you would call moral behavior. And they have no God. And this is also true, as I said earlier, about many Asian religions. Confucianism has no truck with that. Buddhism has no truck with that. It's not a religion of a big father figure giving rules and telling you what's right and wrong. And so far as I can tell, Confucians and Buddhists seem to be as morally upstanding as Christians and Jews. So it doesn't look like it's necessary, but it raises the very interesting question, and that is precisely why do some of these religions gain such a foothold and others not so much? And I mean, why didn't we all become like the Inuit? I mean, and I think there are interesting answers to that, but that's really out of my purview. I think that's something that you have to pay a lot of attention to the anthropological data, the historical data, and the legal data, and that is in the context of the evolution of legal systems as well. But it's clearly not necessary to have a strong sense of right and wrong, as the Inuit surely do, and surely did before they were, as they say, westernized. Powerful sense of right and wrong, and they live by it. Yeah.
So there's one, but two more, and then I think we have to wrap it up. Yeah.
As a philosopher, do you believe there's a hierarchy of moral thinking? And if not, are all moral codes equivalent?
That's a great question. Are all moral codes equivalent? Well, from my own personal perspective, I think there are better and worse ways of doing things. I mean, I think trial by ordeal, by and large, doesn't do a very good job of picking out who are the criminals and who aren't. And so, over time, people came to realize that trial by ordeal, you may not all know what that is. Okay, so in the Middle Ages, the idea was that, for example, if you were charged with adultery, then here's how the trial went. I get a big red-hot poker, red hot, and I put it in your hand. If your hand burns, you're guilty. If your hand doesn't burn, that's because God intervened knowing you were innocent. Now, most people, of course, burned. And so it was realized after a time that this was really an inappropriate way to manage your legal affairs. And so, but changes in the law actually come quite slowly. And the relationship to this deeper platform of moral norms, which may or may not even be spoken. I'm going to get something for my throat.
Oh, let me get it for you.
No, it's in my... I think those relationships are very complicated and can easily and well be studied by social scientists. No, there obviously are better and worse ways of doing things. And from within any perspective, you can, of course, always say, well, I think that's a bad way to do it because X, Y, and Z. And sometimes you'll get people to agree and sometimes you won't. But sometimes norms do change, and then sometimes the laws change. And God, in our lifetime, the sodomy laws, the attitudes towards homosexuality completely changed. And so we can see certain kinds of pressures and movements and various things that are afoot in bringing about social change. So I certainly wouldn't want to say any system or moral code is as good as any other. But we do also see an evolution of moral codes over time, and they are sensitive to changes in social ecology. But it's not something I know about in much detail.
Give you a minute to soothe your voice here.
Yeah, I'll listen to the question. Yeah.
So is it true to say, you don't have to answer this, this is just a ridiculous idea.
Okay.
So is extreme religious fanaticism a disorder of the basal ganglia then? That we should be researching? Maybe that could be the answer to some of the things going on in the world.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a very interesting thing why this probably shouldn't be on the tape, but it's interesting to see why in adolescence we see a great sort of susceptibility to ideology. It doesn't have to be religion. It could be anything. But they're very susceptible to it. And at the same time, we're also seeing that this is a period where there's this tremendous pruning back of synapses, this great smoothing out of the system, and the emergence of a really robust gamma rhythm. And so, and we also see a huge increase in risk-taking behavior. And you kind of like to know how those all fit together. We know that you even see a comparable thing in mice. So it turns out that mice, they have a very short adolescence, like I think it's a day and a half. But during that period, if they are with other mice, they'll take more risks. They'll run up on an elevated maze. If they're by themselves and you put the elevated maze up there, they won't. But if their pals are there, they get up and they scurry around on the elevated maze. They also, alone, they drink a bit of alcohol. But in a group, they drink a lot. That's nice. So, I mean, we of course want to think of many of these things in, shall we say, to put it contentiously, in sort of just psychological terms. But some of them are probably fed by very, very deep underlying biological processes that we can't access through introspection at all.
I think there was one final question, Dr. Swong, and then we have to wrap it up.
Hi.
I then adopt from your view of what you call neurophilosophy, the discipline. And today, again, another demonstration of you updated lots of new information and science. My question to you is that, of course, we know moral code is based on social, psychological, cultural influences. But what's your view on any genetic influences on this moral code?
What are the genetic influences on the moral code? My guess is that where the genes matter most is in the basic platform foundation of bonding and attachment, of caring and being cared for, and enjoying social company and liking social company. And roughly speaking, this also allows for, to a first approximation, it seems like there is a kind of inverse relationship between oxytocin levels and CRF and court levels. And so they go like this. So when court levels fall and oxytocin levels go up, we feel less anxious, we feel good, I feel friendly towards you, maybe we can build a bridge together. And I think that's the important thing. And then in that context, various obvious solutions to certain practical problems arise. Whether those practical problems are how to make a boat, probably better to use wood than rocks, or whether they're social practical problems. What do we do about this deceitful kid? And so I think that the moral codes are, in a way, constrained by things that fundamentally matter to us. And what fundamentally matters to us is the well-being of family and friends. And that's the major constraint. So I don't think of there as being a gene for not lying. Truth-telling just emerges very obviously out of the practical needs in the way that using wood for a boat emerges out of a very practical need. And humans are problem solvers, but so are crows and ravens and chimpanzees and other things. And so I think we use our problem-solving ability in all kinds of domains. And there's no real reason to think that the circuitry for social problem solving is fundamentally different from the circuitry for solving any other kind of problem. And we can see that in the kinds of solutions that different people, widely geographically separate groups, the solutions they come to certain practical problems, like writing. I mean, bear in mind, writing was only invented between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. But we see different groups in different places. The Inuit had a system, the Sumerians had a system, and so forth. Very simple in the beginning, but it was a very practical solution to a problem. There are no genes for writing. There are no genes for reading. What we have is a hugely fantastic pattern recognition brain. And we use that when we read. But there are no genes for it. And I don't think there's any genes for moral codes. That's a long answer. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.
I'd like to, can I just get over here?
Yeah.
We have a tradition in the Department of Psychiatry to thank our Grand Round speakers by welcoming you to our family. Here's a
Oh
baseball
boy, it
hat,
says psychiatry on the back.
CSE. And so when you go running, walking, yogaing, whatever in Solana Beach,
Right.
And you want to prevent your skin from being damaged,
I love it.
please
All
wear
right.
that.
Yeah.
For those of us who are Canadian, it's also a very special honor to
Oh,
welcome
thank
fellow
you.